The Freedom of Information Act, of course, is the people's law. It is designed to allow you all access to what the government's doing, and it does so primarily in two ways. The first way is through access to governmental records. And the second one is through your ability to observe open meetings, public meetings. You can make a request for government records of any level of government in Arkansas. So of course you can request records from the state, but you can also request records from any municipality, any locality. So county government, city government, and they are all subject to the Freedom of Information Act. Now, when you make a Freedom of Information Act request, what occurs most often is first, the governmental entity will typically acknowledge your request, but then that's sort of the last time they will engage with you without you having to worry about what they're doing. Why? Because there remains, unfortunately, a tendency for government actors to try to do as little as they can when it comes to complying with government requests, records requests, I should say. So let's go through some of the motions, what you should do when you make a records request. You can make a records request in any form you want, meaning, as a technical matter, you can call them up, you can send them an email, you can send them a letter. There's no, if they tell you that there's a form, there isn't. So any method by which you want to make a request, you can. Now, if it's not in writing, then you are challenged if they deny that you made the request. So I always recommend that it be made in writing. These days, most governmental entities have email. So I think it's a good idea just to do it in email. It's easy, it's quick, and you have your record and they have their record. As you may know, if you make a records request, they can't charge you for labor, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, but they can charge you for actual costs. Well, actual costs typically are copying costs. So they can charge you a nickel, maybe a dime a page if they're making copies. There are a few instances by law, in statute, in which there's a different amount that they can charge you. Like if you make a request from I'm making it up, but the Arkansas Historical Society. I don't know if they have a different, but some few places have statutory amounts that they can charge you. But putting those aside, and they are indeed quite rare, if you make a request, say an email, you can ask them to email it back to you. No copying costs, no paper, and no labor charge is allowed to be made. It was the housing authority in Little Rock said that they were going to charge $10,000 because they needed to charge for labor. And they misinterpreted language in the FOIA to say, well, the FOIA says we're not allowed to charge for our labor, but if we hire outside labor, we can charge all we want, which of course is a perversion of what it says. It says you can't charge for government labor, not therefore go out and hire private labor. So this individual from the housing authority was charged criminally because there's a criminal provision in the Arkansas FOIA for violating it. And he was charged criminally, and Chris defended him. And Chris is such a good lawyer that he won even though the guy broke the law. So that's how good a lawyer he is. But you can't charge for labor. And so you'll hear, and they'll say it to you when you make a request. Well, you know, it's a lot of time that we're taking away from our work. This is your work. You know how we know this is your work? Because the legislature 50 years ago told you it was. And there's an easy way for you to avoid it. Don't take a government job. But as long as you have that government job, you're obliged to turn over those government records. Incidentally, so you send your FOIA request in our little story, right? You sent your FOIA request now by email, and you requested the response by email, and you point out in your request, therefore, there's no copying costs. Thank you very much. And you think you're sending it to the right place. Because who are you supposed to send it to? The Custodian of Records. Who's the Custodian of Records? Who knows? Usually it's the head of an agency. So you send it to the head of the agency. If you know the lawyer agency, then you tell them also, you copy them also. It's always good to get the lawyers involved as quickly as possible. And then you write in your request, of course, if you're not the right person in your agency for me to send it to, please forward it on and let me know to whom it should be sent. So they can't say, well, I'm not in charge of that. He sent it to the wrong guy. Because now you made a legitimate request of a governmental official, and generally that's considered sufficient to obligate him or her to forward on that email or to inform you as to the right person. Of course, if they don't know, they can inform you that as well. But since, as we started in the narrative, you're sending it to the head of the agency, it seems unlikely that the head of the agency would not know who the FOIA person was. So now you got your FOIA request in. That's the good news. They are required to turn over the records to you immediately unless they are in use or in storage, and then they have 3 days. So surprise, surprise, every record that you want is in use or in storage. I've never met a record requester who's gotten a record that's not either in use or in storage, awarding or affording the governmental agent the 3 days leeway. But 3 days is just 3 days. So rather than fight that, rather than challenge them on whether it in fact was in use or in storage, take the 3 days. Then they're going to write you back. And the first thing they're going to say is, well, your FOIA request is confusing because you haven't specified a scope. Because you see, you've asked for all the emails of John Smith. And the FOIA requires you to be sufficiently specific. And of course, your response is, what's not specific about all? Right? It's specific, it's just big. In fact, there's an Arkansas Attorney General opinion that says exactly that. Big is not non-specific. But if they do that, there's one response to say, I was perfectly specific, just broad. I want all such records. The other way to do it is to say, oh, okay, there's no date restriction. You don't find that specific enough. Give me for the last 5 years. And you might be thinking right now, well, but what happens if I want more? 3 days later, make another request. Right? 2014 to 2009. You get those records. 2009 to 2004. I can do it all day, folks. It's just subtraction. So when they try to play games with you, say, well, that's not specific enough. All right, let's break it down. Year by year. We'll have 20 requests. No problem. Each one gives you a separate lawsuit, should you decide to sue. The other thing that they're going to say is, well, your request is not clear. We understand it as being such and such. You read carefully over their interpretation of your otherwise clear request, because they will shift the meaning of that request oftentimes. So if what they write is not what you want, you tell them. And they might think, oh, well, during this period of ambiguity, of course, the clock's not running. Oh, yes, it is. So you write them back and you say, no, well, you misunderstood. All means all, and records means records. And you still have till Tuesday to get me my records. Then they might ask you for an extension. If they ask you for an extension, for the most part, I think it's worthwhile to give it to them. Reasonable extension. In other words, if they say, can we have more time? You say, how much? And then they tell you, and you decide if that's okay. You say, sure. I don't think I've ever turned down a request for an extension. But don't give an open-ended extension, because then you'll never see anything. They will also, regarding the date issue, they will write you back and say, well, this is actually quite a voluminous request. And the law does, even though the law provides for 3 days to turn over records, when it's not feasible to do it in 3 days, we can take longer. That's a true statement. Can't change the laws of physics, right? And so they will wait for you to acknowledge that. Because if you in any way acknowledge it, they interpret that as an agreement. Now, to some extent, it's okay if you agree with that. But beware when they say, well, it's just going to take us longer. If you write back, thank you, not okay. Okay is obviously an agreement. If you write back, thank you for letting me know, they take that as agreement. So it may be fine to agree to, but know what you're agreeing to. So those are the basic bones of a Freedom of Information Act request. I tell, one moment, when I tell every group that I'm talking to about these requests, since you're here, you're obviously interested in it. If you haven't made at least one FOIA request each year, you haven't done your job as a citizen.